The Federal Reserve System was born from the Panic of 1907, one of a number of short but sharp business contractions in the 19th and early 20th centuries. An attempt by a Montana man named Augustus Heinze to buy up all the country's copper failed, which led to runs that ruined many banks in New York and around the country. Millionaire banker J.P. Morgan, a man hated by most leftists, actually pledged his own money to pull the private economy and the federal government out of the ditch. At the time, the U.S. had no central bank that could make money appear out of nothing. The U.S. was on the gold standard, $20 to an ounce of gold. The phrase, sound as a dollar, was a common testament to how the country kept its money in top condition. But intellectuals and economists kept holding the government banks of England and Germany as a better way of managing a national economy. No one knew then that in the early 1920s, after World War I, the German mark would be inflated so much that it was cheaper to put bills on the wall than buying wallpaper. President William Howard Taft kept the Federal Reserve Bill from becoming law. But in 1912, Teddy Roosevelt's ego got the better of him, and he decided to run against Taft, his hand-picked successor. Roosevelt's daughter once said her dad wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. Certainly he missed being president. Taft and TR split the Republican vote and let Woodrow Wilson win the presidency. Wilson, a one-worlder who viewed the Constitution as just a bunch of suggestions, pushed through the Federal Reserve Bill in 1913, the same year he got the first personal income tax passed. The Federal Reserve was made up of 12 member banks spread around the country, put there for political reasons, and despite its name, it was not a government entity. The need for a crucial vote from a Missouri senator in 1913 led to not one but two of the 12 banks being put in Missouri, in Kansas City and St. Louis. The presidents of these banks and other political appointees would make up the Fed's Board of Governors. From the start, the Fed was a political operation, doing whatever the party in charge of Washington wanted. Americans of that day were rightfully concerned about the federal government being able to make money out of nothing, since until then $20 had been worth an ounce of solid gold for decades. As economist Thomas Woodward noted in a book on the Fed in 1996, people often ask what backs the paper currency the Fed turns out. The short answer, he wrote, is nothing. There are no real assets, public or private, that are specifically pledged to collateralize or back the debt of the government. This means that ultimately nothing backs the money. And Americans have found that out, much to their dismay. The modern Federal Reserve note dollar is worth less than 2% of what the dollar was 100 years ago, and gold hasn't backed our currency for nearly half a century. But in 1913, we were assured by politicians that the value of the dollar would not change, and even better, the Fed would make sure there would never be another financial panic, as this New York Times article stated. In fact, we didn't have any more panics, but only because they changed the names. When a panic worse than any previous panic struck in 1929, President Herbert Hoover dubbed it a depression, then a milder term than panic. Of course, the Fed never learned its lesson. In 1934, new President Franklin Roosevelt pegged the cost of gold at $35 an ounce, a 41% drop in the value of the dollar stolen from the public overnight. He also made it illegal to own gold coins or bullion and confiscated $2 billion worth of other people's money to help stabilize the economy. There's a good case to be made that the Fed itself caused the Great Depression by manipulating credit. During the First World War, the government demanded that the Fed keep its bank lending rates low so our part of the war could be financed cheaply. After the war, the Fed raised its rates sharply to assure that the dollar was still worth its value in gold. The resulting recession bankrupted many farmers already hurting because of a post-war drop in food prices. The Fed then lowered its overnight lending rate to member banks to around 4%, dropping it even further to 2% during 1925. But the cost of borrowing was now so cheap that people started putting borrowed money into our stock market. The economy overheated. People were borrowing more to buy homes and cars as well as stock. The market zoomed and more people came in. Throughout 1928, the Fed raised overnight lending rates to its member banks from just under 4% in early 1928 to an astonishing 14% in mid-1929. That took the fat out of the economy, as well as some muscle and bone. The stock market crashed. At first, it had little effect on the average citizen, but with the money supply now cut by a third, prices dropped and products could not be made for a profit. Millions lost their jobs. Instead of a 6-month panic, the Fed had caused a 10-year Great Depression, ended only by the Second World War. In 1971, government overspending led to President Richard Nixon taking the U.S. completely off the gold standard because we could no longer defend a gold price of more than $40 an ounce. And still, the Fed didn't learn. After going off the gold standard, the dollar suffered so much inflation in the 1970s that the Fed's discount rate had to hit 13% in 1981 to end it. In the early 2000s, a mild recession and the borrowing for the Iraq War led to the Fed cutting commercial interest rates to just over 1% for the years 2002, 3, and 4. Once again, the economy overheated. New laws pushed by politicians to make it easier to own homes led to people buying 2, 3, or more homes and flipping them, selling at a high rate because of cheap money that increased demand. Once again, the economy suffered a blowout, this time in 2008, when the economy crashed so badly, demand simply didn't return. Mortgage and credit card debt hung over the economy for years. The Fed simply opened the money spigot and left it open, with interest rates for member banks near zero. Everyone knows another catastrophe is coming, but nobody, especially the Fed and dovish Chairman Janet Yellen, want to talk about it.